To summarize Joshua into one sentence, we could say that it is the preparation for accompanying the Lord. It was the attitude of accompanying the Lord, whereas Leviticus was the eligibility of accompanying the Lord, Numbers was the method of accompanying the Lord, and Deuteronomy was the principle of accompanying the Lord. Since Torah was the textbook for accompanying the Lord, Joshua was a workbook to exercise the textbook. Especially, it gives us an important spiritual message on the saint's attitude to fulfill Jesus' command and enjoy our privilege given by him. Let's learn the method and try to put it into practice in our daily lives. The Old Testament. Follow the sequence from ages, leaders, key places, key words, national perspective, and authorities perspective to the genealogy of Jesus, the book's allocation, and their representative triplets, the spiritual perspective of prophets, and lastly BC and Adam's chronicle. Please open your Bibles to Exodus chapter 12, verse 14. Now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. Since they entered Egypt in 2238 of the Adam Chronicle, the year they came out of Egypt was 2668. The time background of Deuteronomy was in the 40th year after they had come out of Egypt. Joshua was about the story from just after Deuteronomy to completely conquering the land, but chronically we need to consider the end of the conquest AG as the death of Joshua. It was presumed that the Israelites took just 6 to 7 years to conquer the land, led by Joshua as stated chapter 14 verse 10. So here I am today, 85 years old, when Caleb conquered Hebron, which was the last battle as written in verse 15. Since Caleb was 40 years old when he explored the land from Kadesh during the second year after the exodus from Egypt. The fulfillment of the covenant. Let's see the 3 pillars in the frame of chapters. The whole 24 chapters are divided into 7 parts, and these 7 parts were categorized into 3 sections. The first section was about the provision to discipline the Israelites with 2 examples, Jericho and Ai. Why did the Lord prepare those 2 cases? What were the difference between them? Number 1, preparation to conquer. Let's explore it with the key topics. The Lord commanded them to cross the Jordan River and reconfirm the territory of the promised land to possess. The Lord gave them an instruction before attacking the enemies. He encouraged Joshua and the Israelites to be strong and courageous and emphasized meditating on the laws given by the Lord. Then he commanded them to get their supplies ready and reminded the eastern tribes of their responsibility to help other tribes to conquer the land in chapter 1. Number 2, conquer Jericho. In the case of conquering Jericho, there were 5 major topics. What were they? Spying on Jericho and Rahab's help in chapter 2. Crossing the Jordan River was stated in chapter 3. The priest's first step into the Jordan River while carrying the Ark of the Covenant. Then the water of streaming stopped flowing, and it piled up in a heap of a great distance away from them. So the people crossed over to Jericho as written in chapter 3 verse 16. For their descendants to remember this miraculous incident, the Lord commanded the Israelites to get 12 stones from the river and set up the stones at Gilgal as stated in chapter 4 verse 20. Notice that Joshua set up the 12 stones that had been in the middle of the Jordan at the spot where the priest who carried the Ark of the Covenant had stood, as seen in chapter 4, verse 9. Did the Lord command Joshua to do it? I'm not sure about it, but it was sure that the Lord commanded them to take 12 stones and put them down at the place where they would stay the night, as written in chapter 4, verse 3. It reminds us Moses' Meribah water incident, but I think this is a little different from that incident because Moses had grumbled when he had hit a rock, but Joshua didn't grumble and just set up 12 stones for an extra sign in addition to 12 stones at Gilgal. The significance was that it was on the 10th day of the first month as seen in chapter 4, verse 19. It was the 41st year since the exodus of Egypt. The next story was about the circumcision of the Israelites who were born in the desert and could not be circumcised in the desert due to their unscheduled journey. Why did the Lord command them to be circumcised? It was because the Lord made them his people and was going to fulfill his covenant as stated in Genesis chapter 17 verse 11. You are to undergo circumcision, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and you. A significant story was about the commander of the Lord's army in chapter 5. He came to Joshua and gave him a message as written in chapter 5 verse 15. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy. But the message was the same as the one the Lord had given to Moses when he had called him in the desert. Let's later see the spiritual message in this on the other slide. The conquering procedure of Jericho was described in chapter 6, which was very old and unbelievable. It was not a normal battle. It was done through the Lord Almighty. As stated in chapter 6 verse 20, the wall collapsed because of the people's loud shout. This was an important tip to spiritually understand why Joshua sent 2 spies to Jericho. Was a spy required in order to conquer Jericho? If you look at the collapse of the wall, it was useless because the Lord collapsed it. It seemed to be a test given by the Lord, but there was no clue based on this in the chapter because chapter 2 verse 1 stated that Joshua sent them, not the Lord. Let's review it again in the slide of the spiritual frame. Chapter 6 ended with the curse of rebuilding Jericho, which was fulfilled after around 530 years by King Ahab, as stated in 1 Kings chapter 16 verse 34. In Ahab's time, Hiel of Bethel rebuilt Jericho. He laid its foundations at the cost of his firstborn son, Abiram, and he set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segub, in accordance with the word of the Lord spoken by Joshua, son of Nun. This successful Jericho story was followed by the failed Ai story. Number 3, failure at Ai and by the Gibeonites. Why did the Israelites fail to first conquer Ai? It was because of their sins to the Lord, which was written in chapter 7 between both of the stories. The Lord's anger burned against Israel because Achan took some of the devoted things as stated in chapter 7 verse 1. Joshua and all Israelites took Achan and his household and belongings to the valley of Achor and stoned them to death and burned them as seen in chapter 7 verse 24 to 25. Therefore that place has been called the valley of Achor, which meant trouble. After this the Lord commanded Joshua to attack Ai again with an instruction as stated in chapter 8 verse 1 to 2. The Lord gave a tactic in detail in this case, and Joshua followed and defeated Ai. An interesting command was stated in chapter 8 verse 18. Hold out to Ai the javelin that is in your hand, for into your hand I will deliver the city. It seemed to be like when Moses had lifted his hands when Joshua had fought the Amalekites. Joshua built an altar at Mount Ebal and copied the laws on stones. And half of the people stood in front of Mount Gerizim, and the other half stood in front of Mount Ebal, as Moses had formerly commanded. And then Joshua read all the words of the law, the blessings and the curses as stated in chapter 8 verse 34. To summarize these 3 parts into one sentence, we could say it is the law's providence and punishment. This provision group was followed by the conquest of the land from chapter 10 to 11 and Moses and Joshua's performance in chapter 12. Number 4, conquest. Let's see the order of conquest in the slide of the conquest journey. Conquest journey. Joshua first conquered the central area, Jericho and Ai, and the southern area, Amorites, Makkedah, Libnah, Lachish, Gezer, Eglon, Hebron, Debir, Kadesh, Barnea, to the Gaza area, and Goshen, to the Gibeon area. Then he conquered the northern area. Let's go back to the previous slide. Number 5, inheritance. The next story was about the distribution of inheritance into the tribes. It began with the lands still to be taken as seen in chapter 13 verse 1 to 7. The lands to be taken were described in terms of area. Let's see it in terms of clan as stated in Judges chapter 1 in the slide of the remaining Canaanites. The remaining Canaanites, Judah took possession of the hill country, but they were unable to drive out the people from the plains because they had iron chariots, as stated in Judges chapter 1 verse 19. The Benjamites failed to dislodge the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem, as written in Judges chapter 1 verse 21. It was done by David later, actually his commander Joab. Manasseh didn't drive out the people of Beth-shan, Tanakh, Dor, Ibleam, Megiddo, and their surrounding settlements, as written in Judges chapter 1 verse 27. As in Judges chapter 1 verse 29, Ephraim didn't drive out the Canaanites living in Gezer. Zebulun didn't drive out the Canaanites living in Kitron and Nahalal, as stated in Judges chapter 1 verse 30. Asher didn't drive out those living in the 7 cities Acco, Sidon, Ahlab, Akzib, Helba, Aphik, and Rehob, as written Judges chapter 1 verse 31. Naphtali didn't drive out those living in Beth Shemesh and Beth Anas, as stated in Judges chapter 1 verse 33. Significant thing was the Danites, because they were confined by the Amorites to the hill country, as seen in Judges chapter 1 verse 34. How about the Simeonites? There was no information on their performance except the mention of their path with Judah, as stated in Judges chapter 1 verse 3. Let's go back to the previous slide. Look at the order of the distribution of inheritance. Reuben, Gad, Eastern Manasseh, Caleb, Judah, Ephraim, Western Manasseh, Benjamin, Simeon, Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, Dan. Let's look at the inheritance layout on the map in the slide of inheritance. It was distributed by the order of eastern, central, southern, and northern area of the promised land. Let's see the distribution in terms of Jacob's wives, Rachel's sons located in the central area of the land, and Leah's sons surrounded them. Bilhah's sons defended the north, the northern standard of the camp in the desert. Dan, Asher, and Naphtali were deployed again in the northern area. Zilpah's sons located the north and the east. How did they get inheritance in the promised land? Did they get where they wanted to live? No. They got their inheritance by lot, as stated in chapter 14 verse 2, except Caleb. Caleb got Hebron as per his wish. Hebron was given to Caleb, as stated in chapter 14 verse 13, according to the Lord's promise, as written in Numbers chapter 14 verse 24. But because my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it. This was an important spiritual message. How was Hebron? As stated in chapter 14 verse 12, the cities were large and fortified, and Anakites were there. But Caleb wanted the place even though he was 85 years old, as written in chapter 14 verse 10. Why did he want such a place that was harder to conquer? It was because the Lord had promised him the place. Even though he was too old to fight a strong enemy like the Anakites, he was not scared of them because Caleb trusted in the Lord. This is faith. We have to have this kind of faith. How was Caleb? He was very nice. He seems to be one of the best out of the chosen people, a Judah of Judah, wasn't it? Look at chapter 14 verse 6 and Numbers chapter 32 verse 12. Where was he from? He was a Canaanite. Who were the Canaanites? Why did the Lord identify it? Usually the Bible just mentioned the son of someone, because it was required to distinguish him for a spiritual message to us. Open the book of Genesis chapter 15 verse 19. The land of the Kenizzites, Kadmonites. It was the clan of the promised land when the Lord promised Abraham to give it to him, as stated in Genesis chapter 15 verse 18. We can guess that the Kenizzites had stayed with Judah, or the Kenizzite woman married Judah, and Caleb was selected as the representative of Judah at the exploration of the land. Notice that this is just a guess, and there are different opinions on this. Learning his faith is more important to us. Let's go back to the previous slide. Number 6, inheritance for the Levites. The last part of the inheritance was for the Levites and the cities of refuge in chapter 20 and 21. As written in chapter 21, verse 43, the Lord finally gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give their forefathers, and they took possession of it and settled there, although some foreign people did remain there, as stated in Judges chapter 1. After this, the Lord gave them the rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their forefathers. The Lord handed all their enemies over to them, as stated in chapter 21, verse 44. Number 7, propose. Then Joshua sent the eastern tribes back to their land on east of the Jordan River. But there was a happening on their way due to an altar that they built as evidence of their identity in the future. In chapter 23, Joshua commanded the Israelites to obey all that was written in the book of the law of Moses without turning aside to the right or to the left, as stated in chapter 23, verse 6. And warned them not to associate with the remaining nations there, and not to invoke the names of their gods or swear by them, as seen in chapter 23, verse 7. He urged them to love the Lord, as stated in chapter 23, verse 11. Chapter 24 began with Joshua's speech at Shechem. He reminded the people of the Lord's missionary from Abraham, as seen in chapter 24, verse 1 to 13. Then he declared that he and his household will serve the Lord, as stated in chapter 24, verse 15, and requested them to make their resolution whether or not they will serve the Lord. The covenant was fulfilled, as stated in chapter 21, verse 43. Now let's see spiritual frame of the book of Joshua. The spiritual frame of the book divided into 3 parts: Jericho, Ai, and Law and Treaty. The exploration of the land was probably a restoration of the first exploration and represented Joshua's attitude in carefully preparing the attack, even with the Lord's commitment. And it was to convince them so that they would not repeat the same disobedience to the Lord. Why did Joshua send only 2 spies unlike the first 12? It was probably because he wanted to only send people who he could trust from both tribes, Judah and Ephraim. Rahab represented great faith in the Lord. She just heard about him, in contrast to the Israelites who had seen many miraculous signs in the desert. Her faith entitled her righteousness, as stated in Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, and was an evidence of the Lord's reward, as written in Matthew chapter 6, verse 33. Crossing the Jordan River represented the crossing the Red Sea. Why did the Lord do this again? The crossing of the Red Sea had represented the baptism of the people before entering the land. It was probably required to baptize the ones who were born in the desert and remind them that they were God's people. And it was a restoration of their failure to first attack the land after crossing the Red Sea. Circumcision was required for the people who were born in the desert, because they had not been circumcised in the desert. This was to verify them as God's people. The commander of the Lord's army represented the Lord's calling of Moses. It represented the official ceremony for Joshua as the leader who would lead the people into the promised land. The bottom line of this was that the Lord is God, as stated in chapter 2, verse 11. The Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. The commander of the Lord's army commanded Joshua to take off his sandal, like the Lord had commanded Moses when he had called him. Where was the holy place? It was the place where the Lord presented. That's it. God's presence will make any place holy. My body is also holy because the Holy Spirit dwells in it. Therefore, we have to maintain holiness at all times. The incident of Ai represented the result of disobedience to the Lord and the Lord's control over everything. The Lord demonstrated his management with both the Jericho and Ai cases to the Israelites. Why did Joshua copy the law onto the stones? It was probably for the Israelites to read and obey it every day. It was not for the memorial of the generations to come. Where is the law today? Is it on stone? No, here it is in our hands. Why did Joshua make a treaty with the Gibeonites? He followed the law as stated in Deuteronomy chapter 20 verse 10. When you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. He did not make anything wrong according to the law, but he should have prayed to the Lord as stated in chapter 9 verse 14. The men of Israel sampled their provisions, but did not inquire of the Lord. This is a really important message to us. We have to meditate on the Bible as well as to pray to the Lord. These are both the wings of our Christian life and for building our Christianity. These incidents were happened for the restoration of the creation order and for the fulfillment of the covenant. The covenant was done by that all the land promised to give were allotted to the tribes. Thank you for watching.